Hello and welcome to the Bookshelf, where we discuss books relevant to the study of contemporary South Asia. I am John Vater, a research associate at the Institute of South Asian Studies. Today, I will be in conversation with Peter Martin, the author of China's Civilian Army, The Making of Wolf Warrior Diplomacy. Mr. Martin is a political reporter for Bloomberg News who has written extensively on the US-China relationship. His writing has been published by outlets including Foreign Affairs, The National Interest, The Guardian, the Jamestown China Brief, The Diplomat, and the Christian Science Monitor. He holds degrees from the University of Oxford, Peking University, and the London School of Economics. Peter, welcome to the Bookshelf.
Thanks very much for having me.
So, as a quick explanation for viewers who are maybe unfamiliar with your book, China's Civilian Army looks at the rising assertiveness in Chinese diplomacy in recent years and traces some of its distinct characteristics back to the founding of the People's Republic of China. By recounting how China has historically used diplomacy, as well as how it has been shaped by major leaders and institutions, Mr. Martin offers observation about the type of power that China is set to become in the 21st century. So now to just jump straight into the questions. Your book opens with a really compelling puzzle. Why was it that China struggled to strategically leverage its diplomacy between 2018 and 2020, when the US appeared to be withdrawing from multilateral institutions and its traditional position of global leadership? And you provide historic context in the book by stating that in the space of less than 2 decades, the US's authority has been dented by foreign policy mistakes, including wars in the Middle East, and indecisive response to the global financial crisis, political gridlock, and populism. While it seems that China, on the other hand, has had a thriving economy and the country has managed to project stability. Also, when the pandemic hit, China appears to have had a strong control, over the virus situation. But somewhat counterintuitively, rather than boosting its reputation as a responsible power and a global leader at this juncture, the wolf warriors emerged on the scene, who you say in your book alienated potential partner countries. So what explains China's recent diplomatic assertiveness, and what is wolf warrior diplomacy anyhow?
Yeah, so good questions. I guess why don't we start with wolf warrior diplomacy. So the term comes from this 2017 Chinese action movie called Wolf Warrior 2, which is kind of like a Chinese style, I guess, Rambo-esque kind of movie, which depicts Chinese heroes battling foreign bad guys on the continent of Africa, and kind of became synonymous with this new mood in Beijing, which was confident about China's place in the world and skeptical of US and Western leadership and power. And as Chinese diplomats started acting kind of assertively and even aggressively around the world during, predominantly the Trump administration, where we had examples of Chinese diplomats storming out of international meetings, calling foreign counterparts various insulting epithets, telling them to shut up, spreading conspiracy theories about the origins of COVID-19, the foreign media started to apply this term wolf warrior diplomats to this kind of behavior. And I guess that, my argument is actually that this kind of behavior, even if it hasn't been called wolf warrior diplomacy in the past, really has roots that go back a very, very long way in China's political system. And perhaps we can talk about that in a little bit. But I think when it has emerged and reemerged as a theme in Chinese foreign policy and diplomacy, it's tended to be rooted in both confidence, but also deep insecurities, which have to do with the way that China's political system works, and also have a lot to do with the way that Xi Jinping in particular recently has kind of changed incentives for people acting inside China's political system. So I think that the recent emergence of wolf warrior diplomacy owes a lot to those two forces.
Yeah, you said that the diplomacy is very much rooted in China's political system, and maybe we can dig into that a little bit more. I mean, really, one of the fascinating aspects of your book is the way that you depict the nexus between China's foreign policy and its domestic politics. So, for instance, you state that while Chinese diplomats' actions can sometimes seem aggressive and even bizarre from the outside, they make perfect sense when you look at it from a domestic perspective. Um, so, as a kind of a broad kind of historical framework, a couple times you compare China's political and diplomatic behavior under Xi Jinping to the Cultural Revolution under Mao Zedong. And in one colorful metaphor where you quote another diplomat, he says that in terms of foreign policy, the Maoist nature of politics has remained unchanged. Quote, it's a matter of wiping the foam and leaving the beer. So can you elaborate on the nature of this continuity? Because, I mean, one would think that the ideology underpinning Mao's communist China would be slightly different from the nationalism in Xi's China today.
Yeah, and in many ways it is. In terms of their broader political projects, people often paint pretty broad brushstrokes and talk about Xi Jinping as the new Mao, and I think that most of the time that kind of analysis is pretty off. The main reason for that is that Mao Zedong had a visceral antipathy towards organized bureaucracies and established power structures, and wanted to tear them down wherever he saw them, even in the Communist Party, which he helped bring to power. And that's, of course, what it goes a long way to explaining the origins of the Cultural Revolution. Xi Jinping and his political project is all about control, control by the Communist Party apparatus over the Chinese government, over private industry, religion, civil society, media, academia, and the list goes on. And of course, Xi Jinping's personal control over Communist Party bureaucracy. So really the kind of their political projects are very, very different. But what I think is quite similar, and where the current experience of China kind of rhymes a little bit with that of the Cultural Revolution, is that you have this overwhelming focus on loyalty towards a single individual in the Chinese political system. You have a focus on ideological orthodoxy, and you have a hostility toward outside forces, and especially Western influences, and very visible costs for people who get on the wrong side of Xi Jinping now and Mao Zedong in the past. So under Xi, there's been this sweeping anti-corruption campaign, which has punished more than 1.5 million officials. He is experimenting with re-education camps in China's far western region of Xinjiang, and has taken down some of the biggest political players in China during his tenure, including potential rivals. And when Chinese diplomats find themselves in these kinds of situations, I think their incentives shift very much toward, how do I keep myself safe? And the best way to do that is often to appear very much in line with the political project of the leader who's in charge, right? And so under Mao Zedong, that meant showing that you were a great proletarian soldier, and you were standing up to the hostile forces of capitalism in the West, and fighting the good fight for the Chinese Revolution. And under Xi Jinping, that means, as you said, really pushing forward that nationalist message about how China's time has come, the country will no longer be bullied, lashing out at insults, and that kind of provides a way for Chinese diplomats to keep themselves safe, but also potentially to advance their careers and to get ahead.
And I suppose one of the other continuities is the institutional culture of China's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and the kind of longstanding influence of prominent figures like Zhao and Lai, because in many ways, how Chinese diplomacy behaves from a Western perspective, appears to be unconventional and sometimes unique. So to provide a couple of examples, you state in your book that Zhao himself states that diplomats should think and act like the People's Liberation Army in civilian clothing. And he also enigmatically instructed his colleagues that when they traveled abroad, quote, diplomatic authority is limited. So can you describe, and go into greater detail about some of the ministry's unique rules and some of the practices that the diplomats follow and how all of this came about?
Yeah. So I guess, I kind of see Zhou Enlai as like the founding father of Chinese diplomacy. He's a person whose personality shaped the Chinese foreign ministry a little bit like J. Edgar Hoover's personality shaped the FBI. And he shaped the ministry and the practices of Chinese diplomacy in response to a kind of paradoxical challenge that the communists faced when they first came to power in 1949. This was a political organization, the Communist Party, which had been on the run for decades, living this underground armed existence, constantly threatened, really threatened by outsiders, the nationalists who pursued them across the country, and were acutely aware of how vulnerable their new regime was. And after all, this was the era when the US was really kicking into its anti-communist rhetoric in the early days of the Cold War, and the communists faced a rival government by the defeated nationalists on Taiwan. So there was that kind of instinct to kind of hunker down and to guard against outside influence. But there was this other instinct, which was also very necessary, where China needed to win friends and to build influence across the world and really establish the Communist Party as the legitimate rulers of China. And that required diplomacy. It required talking to other countries. And so the best way that Zhou found to kind of square the circle between those two quite contradictory needs was to tell Chinese diplomats who really, on the whole, had no experience of foreign affairs. Many of them had never been overseas. They'd been, peasant soldiers until a few weeks ago, and now they had to go and, hobnob at diplomatic cocktail parties and things like that. So he told them, look, just act like the People's Liberation Army. How to be soldiers, how to fight a war. Well, now we're going to struggle on behalf of the Chinese Revolution, wearing suits and civilian clothing instead of military attire. And to do that, he required huge discipline, militaristic discipline from his diplomats. He expected behavior to Chinese diplomats to always seek permission before they acted, to stick incredibly closely to talking points, to move around in pairs, to make sure that no secret information was leaked. And actually, these rules were established, in the middle of the Cold War as these two blocks faced off against each other. But actually, they've kind of survived right the way through till today, despite all of the massive changes that China has undergone during that period.
And I would imagine, after reading, hundreds of memoirs about diplomats' lives and your own journalistic coverage, you've become an expert, so to say, on Chinese diplomacy. And so one question, in your view, would be what you see as the strengths and weaknesses of China's unique style of diplomacy. And as just kind of one follow-up, it seemed to me, after reading through the book, that your attitude towards Chinese diplomacy appeared somewhat critical. So you stated, for instance, that while undertaking your research, you became convinced that it is the Chinese system that was holding the country back. So I'm wondering if you can explain some of your thought processes here.
Yeah, so I guess on the strengths and weaknesses, I think that there are real strengths to China's approach to diplomacy, and the key ones, I think, are the ability to retain extraordinary institutional knowledge, which stems partly from, you know, one party rules China the whole time. They don't have to deal with pesky things like changes of government and changes of party like democracies do, and partly from the way that the Chinese foreign service is organized, where specialization is very much encouraged, whereas the US foreign service has a much greater emphasis on becoming generalists. So that's one strength that they have. I think the other one is just this amazing clarity of message that they have. You know, you could talk to a representative from a Chinese trade union or a Chinese professor on a sort of semi-official delegation or an official from the foreign ministry, and you will get the same talking points on Tibet down to the word, repeated again and again and again until everyone outside of the country is absolutely sick of hearing them. But they do have the virtue of creating great clarity, and of course also kind of papering over the kind of interdepartmental and bureaucratic disputes that other countries sometimes show on the surface. Those disputes exist in China. It's just that they're pretty good at hiding them. So I think those are the strengths. That the weaknesses in many ways are kind of the flip side of those strengths, you know, coming across as extremely dogmatic, even ideological, an inability to kind of improvise or to change approach on the spot, to tailor their messages to people in the room, and really those weaknesses kind of cut to the heart of what it means to do diplomacy well. After all diplomats around the world have to deal with messages sent from their capital, but the art of it lies in taking those kind of predefined talking points and spinning them in a way that's going to make them appealing and alluring to the person across the table. And Chinese diplomats really struggle to do that. And, you know, that I think is rooted in China's political system and the peculiar place that diplomacy has always, and I would suggest will always play, as long as the Communist Party retains its kind of paranoia about outside influences and its desire to, have absolute control over messages that are going out, and over who its officials are meeting with and what they're saying, where and when, then I think it's going to be really hard for them to be more effective at diplomacy. And so, as I said, the kind of shortcomings are very much rooted in the political system.
And some of the shortcomings that you highlight, say for countries like Australia, seem to occur largely between China and other developed countries. But one of the interesting narratives that you trace in the book is China's charm offensive with different developing countries. And one would imagine that the perspective by which one looks at Chinese diplomacy might also be inflected by the relative position of that particular nation. So for instance, you talk about the Geneva and Bandung conferences and China's ascension to the UN, the launch of the Belt and Road Initiative. And one of the lines which I found to be really compelling was that Mao had been theorizing since at least 1946 about the potential for China to work with the vast intermediate zone between the capitalist and communist camps whose political sympathies were still in play. So China identifies in some respects with developing countries. And as you noted in your book, Zhao's 5 principles of coexistence resonate with the developing world, maybe in some ways that Western narratives of human rights do not. So do developing countries in the Asian region or elsewhere perceive the merits of the Chinese model and even its diplomacy more favorably than developed nations do? Is there a difference?
I think there is a difference. I mean, it sort of depends where you're looking. So if you think of Africa, there have been, to my knowledge, very, very few examples of wolf warrior diplomacy in China's diplomacy with Africa. Cases where it has happened have tended to be instances of Chinese diplomats attacking the US rather than attacking their host nations. And, you know, China has, for all the criticism that's developed of you know, different types of Chinese economic activity on the continent, it does have a positive development message to sell there. And there are reasons that, you know, governments in Africa might be willing to look past some of the, you know, the human rights issues perhaps that Western governments fixate on a little bit more. But once you know, kind of continue to think about the rest of the developing world, during COVID, Chinese diplomats got in spats with Brazilian government officials, Venezuelan government officials. There were incidents of wolf warrior diplomacy in Papua New Guinea, Fiji, you know, the list goes on. And perhaps most notably and strategically most damaging for China, you know, Chinese diplomats in India were also pretty testy in the way that they communicated. The consulate in Kolkata had a whole series of tweets which were really incredibly inflammatory, to the point of being almost, you know, kind of shocking. And I think that the behavior of Chinese diplomats there, together, of course, with China's policies on the border and the armed clashes that we've seen in recent years and those kind of things, has contributed to quite a strong backlash. So it kind of depends on which part of the developing world you look at. My feeling is that it's not so much kind of developing versus developed world where the dividing line comes. I think it has a lot to do with what the host government thinks of US leadership. And so populist governments, you know, Viktor Orban's Hungary, Vladimir Putin's Russia, to some extent, although it's a little complicated, Duterte's Philippines, have been quite receptive to some of the kind of anti-US messages that Chinese diplomats have put forward. And I think that's because it aligns with the interests of those governments.
Yeah, definitely. You know, the art of diplomacy is very complicated, and it will differ from state to state depending on their own self-interest. So I think that's a good point. And while reading the book, just as a kind of broader philosophical question, I did kind of keep on coming back to the question of, you know, what is diplomacy for, and what can diplomacy achieve? And one of the words which I noticed was reappearing in your book is this word friendship. And you mentioned how the Americans and the Chinese understand the concept of friendship differently. And in your conclusion, you also assert that Chinese diplomacy leaves them effective at garnering influence through inducements or threats, but poorly equipped to make real friends. And listening and persuasion, you know, are also other techniques that I think are wrapped up in this concept, which you alluded to earlier. So, you know, listening and persuasion can help to achieve strategic aims in diplomacy, but one also wonders, you know, whether there are any real friendships, you know, amidst the power plays of international relations and self-interest. And just to play devil's advocate, because we've been talking about Chinese diplomacy quite a bit, is the US is more kind of, you know, I'm putting this kind of in brackets because it's, you know, maybe questionable, friendly diplomacy, outdated in the 21st century, or do you think it will help the US to compete more effectively amid some of these geopolitical rivalries as compared to China's? And you know, just as a specific example, we have Biden's Democracy Summit just took place, so ideology is also beginning to filter in. I don't know if you want to comment on some of the recent diplomatic developments over the past couple of months.
Yeah, there's lots there. I mean, I guess the first area to push back on just a little bit would be, you know, I think a lot of people would take issue with the idea that US diplomacy is more unequivocally friendly than Chinese. The Chinese themselves were very, very upset by tenure of Mike Pompeo as Secretary of State, and I guess a lot of other audiences in different countries kind of agreed with that too. But sort of more generally, there is undoubtedly a very big difference in approach between, say, career US Foreign Service officers and career Chinese diplomats. And there are sort of many points of difference, but I think that that point about friendship and relationships is a really crucial one. And US diplomats do have the leeway with provisos and limitations and the kind of normal reporting that they have to do on foreign contact. They do have the ability to forge quite deep bonds with foreign interlocutors, and they can sustain those relationships for many decades. And when the US bilateral relationship is close enough with a particular country, I think that those relationships probably can develop into quite genuine friendships. I think that on the Chinese side, friendship means something a little bit different. You can and really has almost like an official meaning. The best definition I heard of it was from a former CIA officer who said that to the Chinese Communist Party, a friend is someone who's willing to give you the benefit of the doubt, often in exchange for a degree of access that they wouldn't otherwise get. And so often people who are perceived to be friendly to the interests of the Communist Party are given this label of friends of China or old friends of China. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the personal bonds are especially rich or deep, or that any kind of really privileged information is shared. It just means that the Communist Party views them as useful, frankly. So that is quite a big difference. And it's I actually think that on a personal level, Chinese diplomats are just as capable of as any other country's diplomats at establishing those relationships. But again, it's the political system that kind of holds them back.
That's great. And any comments on Biden's summit for the democracies, or would you prefer to leave it there?
No, I mean, so the Summit for Democracy, I think it really, really got under China's skin, and provides quite a nice illustration of the kind of insecurities that continue to kind of motivate Chinese officials. I remember before the 2020 election, speaking with officials and former officials in Beijing about, whether Trump was going to win a second term or Biden was going to win, and the kind of feeling was that while Trump brought this great unpredictability and headaches, all the headaches that come with that, that Biden was going to reinvigorate US alliances, and he was going to try to have democracies band together to contain China. And the Democracy Summit, while I'm sure US officials wouldn't agree on that characterization of its purpose, that's the way that the Chinese see it, and it really aggravates them. And that's why you saw some of this incredibly vitriolic rhetoric about the Democracy Summit coming out of Beijing, because it kind of plays on their deepest fears in that sense.
Well, thank you so much for joining us for the bookshelf. I mean, we're all now tremendously more informed on China's diplomacy. Very lucid, and wonderful answers. And we really look forward to having you back on the bookshelf in the future.
Perfect. Thanks so much. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks, Peter.